So we are back talking about how to deal with people. And so this lecture is about the case study Combat and Collaboration in Seattle's Historic Minimum Wage Debate, which I thought to be a really interesting case, not just in policy, but also how different groups of stakeholders come together and the difficulties of collaborating to come up with policy choices. And so I think you can read this case and really come up with a lot of different conclusions about what went wrong, what went right, examples of different ways to explain and interpret the things that happened here. But I want to draw your attention to three things that really stand out to me as being particularly important or interesting. The first being decision points, namely the probability of finding agreement when you have such a large group of people together. And so, generally, anytime that we have larger and larger groups of people, it's less likely that they agree. Anytime that we then create more and more decision points, the probability of not agreeing just increases exponentially. And so we can say it like this, right? If we have two people that are agree on 99% of things, well, at that 100th decision, they're probably going to disagree. And does that mean that collaboration fails? Well, let's look at that in a slightly different way. If we expand our group, if we have 100 people in the room and 99 of them agree and one doesn't, well, what does that mean? It certainly increase conflict in our process of trying to come with a decision that we can all agree on. I think one of the things this highlights in this case is there were so many decision points with so many people, it was inevitable that they were going to disagree. The question is, how do you then deal with that disagreement? Do you let it mar the entire process? Do you let it stop things from coming together? Do you let it lead to ultimately a failed process? Or do you find ways to get around it? Do you find ways to compromise? I think there's examples of both in this case. The second thing that stands out to me is really where the case kind of begins and ends, which is the question of whether to collaborate or not to collaborate, or more specifically, Mayor Murray's decision to end the process when it seems like it's going nowhere. And the question of looking at this and going, look, or is this going to lead to a solution, or is this just over? Is it a waste of time for us to continue to invest in all of this? And I think it's a very tough decision, right? So particularly from his perspective, if you are going to leave a decision to a group of people and you're going to say, lock them in a room and say, figure this out, you've got to trust that decision. But when they come back and they can't find one, you're basically saying, look, there's no collaboration or there's no possible compromise on the solution. Like, we can't collaborate to find an idea, so I just can't achieve this. And particularly for Murray, who ran on this, who was a big part of his campaign agenda, he's kind of stuck. And he really thought this was, the way forward. It certainly made the best sense from the beginning, but it rested on the assumption that people could collaborate, they could find a compromise, which, as we see through the case as it plays out, is a very difficult and very dangerous assumption to make. So I think a looming question out there, right, is definitely as you're writing your case study response papers, just think about this from Murray's perspective. Do you end the process there, or do you reinvest and ask them to go back in to find a solution, continue to work? And the last of point here that I think really stood out to me that this highlights is the external pressures to find a solution when it comes to collaborations. So typically when we collaborate, there's not just internal pressure to make things work. There also is external pressures to work. And this is highlighted, and this might be an extreme case for some of us, because this is a very political situation for this group of people. They are coming out with a policy proposal for the entire city of Seattle. They have the mayor, they have the press, they have all these people watching them, looking at what they're coming up with. But really, even in workplaces in smaller settings, when we work together in groups, we're being watched, we're being asked, there's lots of pressure as we invest resources, as we open ourselves up for this risk. Is this going to be a wasted time and effort? If we spent weeks working together on a project and we get to the end of it and we're like, yeah, we couldn't finish the project because we just can't get along, that makes us look terrible as workers, as a team. And so there is this external pressure really to make a collaboration work once we get involved in it. So it ends up being one of those things that needs to be considered on the front end. And one of those strategies that I put out in the last video lecture was to think strategically and plan for risk, because this is a risk, right? The failure or the risk of failing at a collaboration ultimately is a loss of a lot of time and energy, a loss of a lot of resources, a lot of capacity, a lot of things that could have been devoted to other projects. And so, is it worth investing in a collaboration when you don't really know when it's going to work? And so, I think this case highlights a lot of those issues. And really, the point overall is that collaboration is not as easy as it seems, particularly when we have a lot of people coming together from very, very different perspectives. So, as you write your case studies papers and think through all this, there's a lot of questions out there. But I think some of the name one, or the most important one, is to think about whether or not this was successful. Whether or not how we define success in a collaboration, if this achieved this, it certainly didn't. Well, to a certain extent, it didn't achieve some of the goals that Mayor Murray had set out from the beginning. But I mean, again, do you think this is successful? If not, how could it have been successful? What went right and what went wrong here, and what would you have done differently? Or these are all kind of key questions to begin to think about as you're writing that paper, because the answers are very telling and very important as we think about other collaboration in other settings.